Hi everyone, Freshy here with another Lost Ark video. Today I have a tier list for you, and this isn't your normal tier list. This one will be about how easy it is to get the MVP with all the classes. But before we go into the list, we need to set some ground rules and explain how these were being measured. Tier list is based on each class performance in the current stage of any EU version of the game, not what a class will be in the future and not what a class is currently in Korea. I understand some classes are much weaker in the current stage of the game and they drastically spike up in damage and performance later, and this is why the tier list shouldn't be taken super seriously. The way I based each class on was equal item level and at least 3 level 3 engravings with a decent gem setup. Equal item level was used on 1340, 1370 and 1400 content, and I have only taken note of the MVPs when all the party members had the same or equal gear, whether it was on Igrexion and Oreja normal, or Yoho, Oreja hard and Argos phase 1, or even Argos phase 3. I collected the data over a month of doing endgame tier 3 content on my main and my alts. Keep in mind that the MVP isn't a measure of a skill or shows off how good or bad each class is. All the classes can get the MVP in the hands of a good player, so don't take this tier list like a personal attack to your main class. First, we are moving Bard and Paladin into a support tier, as everyone knows that those two classes can pretty much guarantee MVP 90% of the time if they spam heals, and we are only interested in damage dealing MVP classes. Berserker is a class that throughout whole tier 3 content is able to get consistent MVPs regardless of item level and engravings. Oftentimes, Berserker with level 3 Mayhem and level 3 Master's Tenacity was able to out DPS classes with a much better setup and a higher item level due to how strong the class is. With all of that in mind, Berserker is going into S tier. GUNLANCER with either a red or blue build performs equally in terms of damage and stagger. Unfortunately, that amount of damage will not be able to keep up with the likes of other high DPS classes, and only time you will see a GUNLANCER getting MVP is when those classes are not in the same group as a GUNLANCER or when you group up with lower geared players. With that being said, GUNLANCER goes into B tier. WARDANCER, despite its damage, is one of the classes that struggle to perform and keep up with the damage numbers against the other classes in the current stages of the game. The class gets a big spike in damage with the relic set and becomes more consistent and can keep up with other high damage classes. At that level, it all comes down to having good rotations and not missing your skills to secure an MVP award. Since I'm basing this tier list on the current state of the game and where the classes are, WARDANCER goes into B tier. Scrapper, despite its popularity, is a class that performs really well in the current stages of the game. Every Scrapper that I had in my group, in 90% of the cases, was able to get the MVP with a 40% plus damage dealt, out DPSing other classes, and even when the Scrapper didn't get the MVP, the damage was always between 30 and 39%. But the consistency to keep up with the S tier classes in terms of damage causes Scrapper to go into A tier. SOULFIST is a class that is not very popular, and the data I was able to collect due to that is very lacking. The few SOULFISTs that I had the pleasure of grouping up with were not able to deal any significant damage that would get them anywhere close to getting the MVP. The class definitely gets better the higher you progress it, but since I am basing the tier list off of the data I was able to collect and not what class will be in the future, I have to put SOULFIST in C tier. If you're a SOULFIST main and you disagree with this, let me know in the comments if I'm being wrong. Striker is in the same boat as WARDANCER due to similarity in playstyles and builds. It also struggles to deal a significant amount of damage at the current stage and is a class that performs much better in later stages of the game. Striker is one of the most balanced classes according to the Korean developers, but due to the fact I have not seen almost any Striker player stay competitive with damage or deal a significant amount of damage to get the MVP, I am putting Striker in C tier. GLAIVIER is a newly released class on the West, and while my data doesn't go back 1 month and I only had less than a week to see how the class performs while also playing it myself, I am putting it in A tier for the fact that every GLAIVIER was able to stay competitive and almost always gets between 30 and 39% damage dealt if they were not the MVP. This is only for the Pinnacle GLAIVIER, as a control build deals significantly less damage and is hard to get close to 30% damage dealt. DEATHBLADE is very popular class and almost always you can have one in your group if you really want it. I have mixed feelings about the class and how often it gets the MVP, as due to it being popular, I have seen a lot of DEATHBLADEs that struggle to deal any significant damage with the Surge build, but on the other hand, those that are able to get the MVP are always above 40% damage dealt. I will put the DEATHBLADE in A tier due to the fact that the class can absolutely explode in damage if played by someone who knows how to deal damage. Shadowhunter is an absolute MVP collector that requires very little for how much damage it can dish out. It stays very competitive with other high damage dealing classes and often doesn't require even 3 level 3 engravings to get the MVP. If there is no high damage dealing classes in a group, Shadowhunter always gets the MVP with 40% plus damage dealt, while it stays between 30 to 39% when there are classes that can do the same amount of damage. With all of that said, Shadowhunter goes into S tier. Sharpshooter is my main class, so I will put aside the bias and be realistic. At lower tier 3 levels, I was able to get the MVP almost every time at Armored Nakresena, Igrexion, Yoho and Oreja normals, but doing Argos P3 and Oreja hard with other 1400 players shows that the class falls off a little bit and getting MVPs isn't as easy anymore, but I am always able to stay competitive with 30 to 39% damage dealt. Sharpshooter can absolutely explode if your rotation is on point and the boss isn't interrupting your attacks too much, so with that I am putting it in A tier. DEADEYE is unfortunately the same case as SOULFIST, not a popular class that makes my sample size very small. Despite that, the few DEADEYEs that I encountered were not able to stay competitive with damage, and on a best case scenario they were able to barely reach 30% plus, but I have not seen a single DEADEYE yet get the MVP when I was in a group with them. It doesn't help the fact that most of them play Pistolier build, but if you're a DEADEYE maid and you can get the MVPs and you think I'm wrong, please let me know in the comments. I have put DEADEYE in C tier. As I already stated, I am basing the tier list off of my current data and not what the class can and will be in the future. Artillerist is the absolute opposite of DEADEYE when it comes to collecting MVPs and dealing damage, despite its somewhat lower popularity. It is a class that simply requires no explanations, as it goes head to head with other high damage dealing classes and often wins the MVP battle. I have an Artillerist alt at 1340 item level with 3 level 3 engravings, and I have not lost a single MVP on Igrexion and Oreja normals to any other class with equal gear and stats. I only lost the MVP to Bards and Paladins, but I don't count those as lost MVPs due to the nature of the two support classes. With that being said, Artillerist goes into S tier. Gunslinger, despite its popularity, has been pretty underwhelming from the ones I was able to group up with. Even when high damage dealing classes were not in the same group as Gunslinger, it would almost always struggle to stay competitive with damage. Now, is that the problem with the class itself, to not be able to dish out the damage, or the player not knowing how to properly utilize all 3 weapon stances and have proper rotation, is the question. I will put Gunslinger in B tier due to the fact that the few ones I saw were absolutely exploding with damage, but my data showing that the percentage of those players is very small. Let me know in the comments what you think about the Gunslinger. Sorceress is a very popular class that is pretty self-explanatory and doesn't require too many explanations. Even not having the most optimal setup and gear, I witnessed Sorcerer out DPSing much higher gear and better setup classes, and most of the time staying about 40% damage dealt. Very deservingly, it goes into S tier. Now that we have a rough idea of where each class stands in terms of getting the MVP, I will be doing the final rank up in each tier by putting a class in either upper or lower part of the tier that they are in. Starting with the support tier, Bard, due to its much larger healing output, is easier to get the MVP over Paladin that has lower but more consistent healing. Striker goes into upper C tier due to its consistency with damage and difficulty to pull off good rotations, while both DEADEYE and SOULFIST shared the lower C tier due to low and inconclusive data that only showed how much these two classes struggle with dealing competitive damage compared to other classes. In B tier, Gunslinger takes the upper tier due to how much higher and consistent damage is compared to other two classes, while GUNLANCER follows up with a close second, and a WARDANCER, leaning more towards similarities with Striker, takes the lower tier. Main reason why WARDANCER is not in C tier with the Striker is that I have a WARDANCER alt with which I am able to get MVP only where there are other classes that deal similar amounts of damage. In A tier, all the classes are very close and very similar to one another in terms of DPS and amount of MVPs they can get. DEATHBLADE will be on the top spot, mainly due to the surge in the hands of a really good player can deal out the damage that would match the classes in S tier, but that damage isn't always as consistent. Sharpshooter will go on a second spot, mainly due to the class being my main and the class that I have played the most, and since I am basing the tier list on my own data, I can comfortably say that I have only lost MVP against other 5 classes that are ranked higher. While Scrapper and GLAIVIER hold the third spot, being almost the same in terms of damage output and the amounts of MVPs I was able to record. It got really interesting in S tier as I have tested these 4 classes by putting them in the same group and did 10 Egrexion runs at 1340 item level. All 4 classes had 1340 item level with 3 level 3 engravings and full level 4 and level 5 gems. Out of 10 runs, Sorceress was able to get the MVP for most damage dealt in 9 runs, while Artillerist only got 1 MVP run. Out of those non-MVP awards, the highest damage dealt, Artillerist, holds very firm second spot, while Shadowhunter and Berserker equally share the third place. So with that in mind, Sorceress takes the top S tier spot, followed up by an Artillerist, and then sharing the spot on the third place are Shadowhunter and Berserker. Hopefully I have not upset anyone by putting their main class into a tier that they don't think it deserves. If you think this is the case, please let me know in the comments and explain why certain classes should be in a higher tier while some may be in a lower tier. As already mentioned, I based this tier list off of my own data that I collected for 1 month. That is the main reason why some of the classes are in a tier where they are. Keep in mind that the tier list is not a representation of how good or bad certain class is. This tier list was made for fun and should not be taken super seriously. I wanted to do something fun, and tier lists are always something that either go really well or a lot of people get upset. Regardless of that, hopefully you still enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.